In 1878, the New Mexico wind carried more than dust across Painted Hollow Ranch. It carried secrets. Rhett McCallan, a rancher carved hollow by grief, thought he'd hired a quiet drifter named Jessie. But Jessie was no drifter, and not even a man. She was Ellie Harper, a woman fleeing a predator who claimed her as property. When her past thundered back in the form of Silas Vaughan and his riders, the ranch became more than land and cattle. It became a battleground where truth cut deeper than bullets, and where survival meant risking everything for redemption. The year was 1878, and the wind blew hard across the scarred skin of the New Mexico territory. Dust rolled in waves across the flatlands carried by heat and silence. In the heart of it stood Painted Hollow Ranch, a sprawling patch of stubborn earth, fenced by sweat and guarded by a man who'd long since stopped believing in second chances. Rhett McCallan, 39, was not a man known for kindness or conversation. He spoke with his hands, with his boots on the ground, and with the unbending code carved into his bones by loss. Once he'd had a wife who softened the sharp edges of his soul, but the fever took her 3 winters back. Since then, Rhett lived like the land he worked quiet, dry, and unwilling to give anything unless pushed. His ranch was order, his life was duty, and his grief had settled into the wood of his porch like a permanent stain. He didn't want new ranch hands, but the herds were growing restless, and the fences needed mending. So when a lean young man rode up on a wind-battered mare hat, pulled low shoulders, hunched like he'd lived too long in shadow, Rhett didn't ask questions. The boy gave a name, Jessie, and offered his hands. That was enough. Painted Hollow didn't care much for words. Jessie worked hard, real hard. Never missed a sunrise, never shirked a chore. He was quiet, kept his eyes down, didn't gamble or drink with the boys. Most hands saw it as odd. Rhett saw it as reliable. The kid was skittish, though, always covered head to toe, even in the August heat. Never took off that wide-brimmed hat, even at dinner. And when night came, he'd sleep outside the bunkhouse under a lean-to, like he was allergic to warmth. The ranch hands whispered. Bo Crenshaw, Rhett's oldest and most bitter rider, liked to stir the pot. Said Jessie moved strange, too graceful. Said he caught Jessie talking real soft to a horse one night like it was a baby. Said that kid was hiding something. Rhett didn't respond. He wasn't one for rumors, and he sure as hell wasn't one for Bo's brand of poison. What mattered was the work, and Jessie never failed him. Still, something gnawed at Rhett in the quiet. He started noticing Jessie more than he meant to, the careful way he saddled a horse, the almost reverent way he mended wire. There was pain in that kid's shoulders, the kind Rhett knew well, and grief, maybe, or fear. He told himself it didn't matter, that he was just looking out for his ranch. But truth was, Jessie haunted him, like a flicker on the edge of a lantern's glow, familiar but unreadable. Then came the morning at Larkspur Bend, a hidden curve of River Rhett kept for himself, where the cottonwoods bent low and the world forgot to be cruel. He'd ridden there to clear his head. But instead of peace, he found Jessie waist-deep in the water shirt shed dark hair wet and loose down her back. Her back. That's when it broke. The silence. The lie. The image Rhett had built of Jessie shattered like glass beneath boot heel. Jessie wasn't a boy. She wasn't even Jessie. She was a woman, and she'd been living a lie on his land for weeks. Rhett didn't know whether to feel fury or betrayal, or something worse, recognition. Because when he looked at her wide-eyed, cornered, wild with fear, he didn't just see deception. He saw survival. He saw someone who'd run far and hard from something cruel. And he saw for the first time in years the flicker of a life that didn't start and end in silence. What began as a lie was no longer just a disguise. It was a fight to stay alive. And in that moment at the river's edge, Rhett McCallan realized that Painted Hollow was no longer the same because neither was he. Neither. The sun hadn't yet burned the chill from the early light when Rhett McCallan saddled up and rode out alone, needing air that didn't taste like suspicion or dust. Things on Painted Hollow Ranch had been shifting beneath the surface like river silt stirred by a boot heel, and Rhett felt it in his gut. The men were muttering more, looking at the new hand with narrowed eyes, and though Rhett kept his face unreadable, his instinct prickled like a thorn stuck under the skin. The one they called Jesse was different, too quiet, too careful. He moved like he was afraid to be noticed and desperate not to be caught. Rhett had seen that kind of fear before. It lived in his own mirror the year his wife died. So that morning Rhett rode without saying a word, letting the horse find its rhythm beneath him, headed toward a bend in the Larkspur River where the water curved like a secret and the cottonwoods stood tall enough to block out the world. He didn't expect to find anyone there. It was a place few knew. Of a place Rhett went when his grief roared too loud for silence to smother. The moment he stepped down and tied his horse to a tree, he heard movement soft, deliberate, and his spine stiffened. He moved slow as he would toward a rattler, his hand grazing the butt of the colt at his side. He slipped through the trees like breath through a crack in the door. And then he saw it, Jesse, waist deep in the water shirt peeled away and draped on a river rock, hair tumbling down in a loose dark cascade. Only it wasn't Jesse, not the Jesse Rhett had hired, not the boy with the stiff shoulders and gravel voice. This was someone else entirely, a back curved with unmistakable softness, skin pale against the sun's shimmer. Her arms rose as if sensing she wasn't alone, hands cupping water, unaware of the man in the trees, whose heart had just forgotten how to beat in rhythm. Rhett took one unsteady step backward, but a twig cracked beneath his boot, loud, sharp, final. She spun eyes wide, chest heaving, and in that single breathless second, their worlds collided and collapsed. Rhett's mouth opened before his mind caught up. What in God's name? He began, his voice strangled with disbelief. She grabbed for the shirt, dragging it across herself with shaking hands, hair plastered to her face, but her eyes never dropped. "I can explain," she said, but the words didn't soothe anything. They only made the wound deeper. "Explain," Rhett barked, stepping forward, now the heat rising fast behind his ribs. "You lied to me. To everyone. You came into my home as a damn ghost and made a fool of me." Her shoulders squared beneath the dripping cloth, and for the first time since he'd known her, or thought he'd known her, she looked him dead in the eye. "I came here to survive," she said. "Not to deceive, not to hurt anyone, but to stay alive." Her voice didn't tremble. Rhett blinked, caught off guard by the steel beneath the softness. "You think wearing trousers and hiding your face gives you that right?" he shot back. She took a shaky breath, then lifted her chin. "You think I had a choice?" And just like that, something shifted. The rage in Rhett's chest flickered, not vanished, not forgiven, but paused as her words settled into the hollows of his ribs. "My name is Ellie Harper," she said, voice low and tight like rope drawn taut. "I used to live near Dust Haven, until Silas Vaughan decided I was his to take. I ran. I cut my hair. I changed my name. You think I wanted to sleep in the dirt outside the bunkhouse every night? Pretend to be something I'm not just to earn enough to eat?" Her voice cracked and she looked away for just a breath. I was safer as a lie than I ever was as a woman. Rhett stood motionless, fists clenched, breath hard. The river whispered behind her, the water too clear to conceal anything now. Ellie. Her name rippled through him like an echo in a canyon. He looked at her, truly looked, and saw all the things he hadn't dared name before, the way her steps had always been too light, the way her voice caught on certain words, the way his own eyes lingered too long without reason. The signs had always been there, buried beneath his blind practicality. He just refused to feel them. The anger drained slower than shame. "You should have told me," he muttered. "I couldn't—" She snapped, voice suddenly fierce again. "You'd have thrown me out or worse." That cut deeper than he expected because it might have been true. "You think I'm like him?" he asked, voice low. Her lips trembled, and for a moment she didn't answer. Then she shook her head. "No. If I thought you were like Silas, I wouldn't have lasted a day on your ranch." The silence between them swelled, filled with things too heavy to say. Rhett looked away toward the trees, toward the horse still tied and calm, unaware that the world had changed in the space of a heartbeat. "This changes things," he said finally. "For you or for me?" she asked. He didn't have an answer. What he did have was a memory of her voice, low and steady, when speaking to horses, of her hands, calloused from honest work, of the way she stood now, shaking but proud, more real than any lie ever told. He nodded slowly. "We'll figure it out," he said, though his voice wasn't certain. "But from now on, no more lies." "You got that?" Ellie looked at him for a long moment, and then she nodded. "No more lies." Rhett turned away, walking slowly back to his horse. But everything felt different. The air, the weight of the colt at his side, even the shape of the trees. Behind him, Ellie Harper pulled her shirt tighter around her frame and stepped from the water. She wasn't hiding anymore. And Rhett McCallan. He didn't know whether he'd just lost control of his ranch or found the one person strong enough to match the wildness of his land and the ruins of his heart. When they returned to Painted Hollow Ranch from the river that morning, the silence between Rhett McCallan and Ellie Harper was heavier than the saddlebags swinging at their hips. Something sacred had been ruptured not just between two people, but in the fragile rhythm of the ranch itself. Rhett said nothing to the men that day. He didn't call a meeting, didn't explain a thing. Ellie, still damp from the river, her hair braided hastily down her back, kept her head down, and got to work like she always had. But the shift was already unfolding, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The men began to notice the small changes, the way Jessie now moved with slightly less tension in the shoulders, the curve of a cheekbone not hidden by dirt or shadows, the way Rhett's eyes followed her just a little longer than before. Bo Crenshaw, a man whose jaw was as stiff as his opinions, took it all in from his perch near the tack shed, chewing tobacco like it was righteous fuel. Bo had never taken kindly to newcomers, especially ones who didn't play by his version of manhood, hard, loud, and unquestioned. To him, Ellie wasn't just an oddity. She was a threat, a woman disguised as a man, working beside them, eating at their table, and worst of all, maybe sharing the same quiet with Rhett that Bo had once considered his own. No, it didn't sit right, and men like Bo didn't sit long with discomfort before setting it on fire. The rumors started small, like sparks kicked up from a horseshoe. "That ain't no boy," he muttered to Mick Talbot, another hand, while cinching a saddle. "I seen the way she walks, the way she don't shave. That ain't stubble, it's a mask." Mick chuckled nervously, uncertain whether to laugh or argue. But the seed had been planted. By supper it had sprouted. Ellie entered the bunkhouse dining area, same as every night, plate in hand. Boots' muddy face expressionless. But this time the conversations dropped just slightly. The usual laughter dipped. A few eyes darted up from tin plates, then quickly back down. She sat near the stove as always, but suddenly the empty chairs around her weren't from coincidence. They were from intent. Across the room, Bo leaned back in his chair, arms folded, watching her like a rattler sizing up a field mouse. Rhett noticed it all. From the main house window he could see the fracture beginning to split down the spine of his crew. He heard the clipped sentences cut short when he entered a room. He saw the questions behind every glance, not just at Ellie, but at him. He'd always been respected, not because he demanded it with a gun, but because he led with an unshakable code. But now that code was being tested in the court of male pride under the gavel of whispered judgments. Dusthaven wasn't a place that forgave strangeness, and nothing was stranger in their eyes than a woman pretending to be a man, and a man like Rhett, allowing it, maybe even protecting it. Ellie felt it in every gesture. The once passable silence she lived in had turned hostile. Cowhands no longer passed tools her way. Jokes no longer reached her ears. Her identity, once hidden like a scar beneath a shirt, was now an open wound, and the flies were circling. She tried to work harder, as if effort alone might smooth the edges, but it only made her stand out more. She was too competent, too precise, too controlled. Some began calling her that girl when she walked away. Others spat it outright. Should have known she weren't one of us. And Beau, self-proclaimed judge of decency, fanned the flames. She tricked us, he said one night by the fire pit. She made fools of us all, and Rhett's just letting her. Rhett confronted Beau only once, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a branding iron. If you got something to say, Rhett had said quietly, say it to me. Beau's jaw worked. I already did. That night, Rhett sat on the porch steps of the main house, whiskey untouched beside him, watching the stars with a bitterness that gnawed like rust on iron. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't asked for Ellie's secret, her pain, her fire. But now that it was in his hands, he couldn't look away. He'd seen her stand her ground in the corral when a bronc bucked free. He'd seen her lift fencing rails twice her size, dirt streaked across her face like war paint. He'd seen her face down truth, even when it cut her to the bone. And more than that, he respected her, which made the whispers feel like poison spreading in his veins. Inside the house, Ellie moved quietly still, avoiding his gaze, still unsure what he truly thought. But she heard the whispers too, and they hurt more than any wound Silas Vaughan had ever given her, because here on this land she had earned her place on, they still only saw her as a lie. And yet Rhett never sent her away. He didn't speak out, not yet, but he stayed, ate with her, walked the line with her, let her presence become part of the place, even as it unraveled the order he'd clung to for years. And Ellie, she stayed too, even when everything in her wanted to run again. She'd been running her whole life from fear, from men, from shadows. But something in the way Rhett hadn't turned his back made her believe, maybe for the first time, that someone wouldn't. And that belief, as fragile as it was, kept her tethered to the dry red soil of Painted Hollow, even as the world around her tried to shake her loose. The heat that day hung like smoke over Painted Hollow Ranch, thick and waiting. The kind of heat that made the ground shimmer and the air go still, as if the land itself knew something was coming. And something was. Just past high noon, the dust on the horizon rose fast and high, too much for a single rider. Ellie Harper was standing by the corral, sweat beading on her brow, hammer in hand, mending a busted rail when she saw it. Her gut turned to stone. Rhett McCallan stepped onto the porch of the main house, squinting into the light as 5 figures broke through the haze. The lead rider sat too straight in the saddle, too relaxed for a man traveling with others, and wore a long black duster that billowed like a vulture's wings. Even before she saw his face, Ellie knew. Silas Vaughan, the man who once pressed his ring into her collarbone like a brand, the man who bought lawmen with the same ease he bought horses, the man who'd smiled while saying, "You don't need to love me. You just need to be mine." Rhett's fingers curled toward the revolver at his hip instinctively. He didn't need a name. One look at Ellie's face, pale beneath the sun eyes wide with a fear he'd never seen on her before, told him everything. The riders reined in horses, snorting and stomping. Silas dismounted with a slow arrogance, glancing around the ranch yard like it belonged to him. His hand brushed the butt of his gun, but didn't draw. Not yet. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his voice like syrup poured over nails. "You found yourself a nice little corner of the world, Ellie. Even fooled this whole ranch full of men. That's quite the performance." Ellie didn't move, didn't answer. Silas turned to Rhett. "You must be McCallan. Fine spread you got here. Shame it's built on stolen goods." Rhett's eyes never left him. "She's not yours, Vorn," he said, voice low flat. "You've got no claim here." Silas chuckled. "Oh, Rhett, she's not just some runaway maid. She was promised. Legally." He pulled a folded paper from his coat and waved it like a showman. "Marriage contract. Her father signed it. Real official." Ellie's voice cracked across the space like a whip. "He sold me," she said, stepping forward, shoulders squared. "You don't own me, Silas. You never did." Silas's smile faltered just a flicker. "That's not how it works out here," he said. "A deal's a deal. You ran off before the wedding night, but that doesn't make it void. Makes you a thief. And me, I've just come to collect what's mine." Rhett stepped off the porch, slow and steady, every step deliberate. "You'll collect nothing but a scar if you don't turn around and ride back the way you came." The other riders tensed. Hands hovered near holsters, but Silas didn't move yet. "You gonna shoot me for taking back my bride, McCallan?" he sneered. "Or is this more personal now?" He gestured toward Ellie. "You get sweet on the help." That's when the laughter came, cruel and oily, aimed not just at Ellie, but at Rhett's pride. And that's when the air changed. Ellie didn't wait. Her hand went under the hem of her shirt where her Colt was holstered tight against her ribs. She'd kept it there every day since the river. For this moment. For this man. The gun came up faster than anyone expected. The shot cracked like lightning across an open plain. Silas staggered backward, yelling, blood blooming on the outside of his coat. His shoulder, not his chest. Intentional, controlled. He dropped to one knee, face twisted in fury and disbelief. The other riders started to draw, but Rhett's voice thundered through the yard. "Don't even think about it." He had his gun drawn, barrels, steady eyes full of fire. The ranch hands who had spilled out from the bunkhouse and barn froze. Some still held pitchforks or ropes. Some just stared. No one moved. Silence fell again this time, sharp and waiting. Silas groaned, clutching his arm. Ellie stood tall, her face pale, but her hands steady. "I'm not a runaway. I'm not your property. I'm a woman with her own damn will. And I said no." Rhett walked slowly to her side, then past her, standing between her and Silas like a living wall. "You step foot on this land again," he said, pointing his gun directly at Silas, "and the next one won't be a warning." Silas looked up at him, hatred twisting in his face. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You're protecting a liar, a criminal." Rhett didn't blink. "I'm protecting what's mine. And unlike you, Vorn, I don't mean that as ownership." He lowered the gun, but the warning hung thick in the air. "Get off my land." Silas rose slowly, favoring the wounded arm. He looked at Ellie once more, not with lust this time, but something closer to loathing, and maybe fear. Then he turned, mounted his horse with the help of one of his men, and rode out without another word. The others followed. Not one of them looked back. The cloud of dust they kicked up lingered for a long while before finally disappearing. Rhett holstered his gun. The tension didn't break. It just shifted. He turned to Ellie. She still hadn't moved. Her eyes flickered with everything she couldn't say. Relief, terror, exhaustion, pride. He stepped closer, reached out, and took her trembling hand in his. "You did right," he said softly. "You stood your ground." She nodded, but her knees looked ready to buckle. He didn't hesitate. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders and guided her toward the house. The men around them remained still. Some nodded, some looked away. But no one said a word. Ellie Harper had just claimed her name in full view of every soul on that ranch, and Rhett McCallan had made it clear that name would be safe here. In the days following Silas Vaughan's humiliating retreat from Painted Hollow Ranch, something in the air shifted, not loud or sudden like the crack of Ellie's pistol, but slow and steady, like a thaw after a brutal winter. The ranch hadn't seen gunfire in months, but that single shot had rippled through every fence-post water trough and porch board. Folks still spoke in hushed tones, especially in the bunkhouse, but now it was less out of suspicion and more out of reverence, or in some corners, resentment. Beau Crenshaw, who'd always claimed to smell rot before it turned, didn't say a word after that day. He packed his things 2 mornings later, saddle creaking as he rode off before breakfast, no farewell offered, and none requested. A few of the younger hands followed not out of loyalty to Beau, but because they couldn't stomach the idea of change. Or maybe they feared a woman who'd face down a man like Silas, and didn't flinch. But the majority stayed. These were men who had watched Ellie Harper swing hammers until her hands bled round-up cattle through dust storms, and work harder than most of them ever had. They couldn't unsee that. And now, standing in broad daylight as herself not hidden beneath a boy's name or men's clothing, Ellie commanded a new kind of respect, one that came not from pretending to be a man, but from proving what she could do in spite of being a woman in a world that gave them so little room. The transformation wasn't loud. Ellie didn't declare her return to femininity with lace or frills. The first day she wore a plain navy work dress Rhett had kept from his late wife's belongings, not because she wanted to wear a dead woman's memory, but because it was practical and it fit, and it said plainly, "I'm not hiding anymore." Her hair, always tucked beneath a hat, or tied tight beneath a kerchief, was now braided down her back, or left loose at sunset, catching the last light like polished copper. The roughness hadn't left her. Her boots were still caked in mud, her hands calloused from labor, but something gentler now surrounded her. A kind of grace that didn't ask for space, but made it by simply existing. The other hands adjusted some slowly, some with genuine ease. They began calling her by her proper name Ellie, not with mockery, but with cautious respect. The jokes around the fire resumed, and though fewer were directed at her, she'd occasionally add a comment that left the whole group in stitches. It was healing in its own crooked way, a return to something resembling community. And then there was Rhett. He never made a speech, never explained himself, never apologized for the quiet shift in the way he looked at her. But the change was visible to anyone with eyes. He stood closer to her now, not possessively, but protectively. His eyes sought hers when decisions needed making. They shared coffee each morning on the porch before the sun cleared the ridge, speaking few words but existing in a rhythm that had its own language, the scrape of her spoon in the mug, the way he tapped the side of his cup twice before standing her brief smile when she beat him to finishing chores. She no longer slept outside the bunkhouse. Without a word, Rhett had cleared out the old storeroom beside the main house, laid down a fresh mattress, and set a basin with clean water and a fresh bar of lye soap beside it. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And in that room, under the shelter of his roof, but behind her own door, Ellie began to feel something she hadn't in years, safe. Not just safe from Silas or men like him, but safe to breathe, to rest, to stop pretending. She hung a piece of wild sage over the door, burned it some evenings. Not for superstition, but to remember what it smelled like to begin again. As for Rhett, the man who'd once moved through grief like a ghost through empty halls, he too began to thaw. He laughed more not loud, but real. He spoke softer, listened longer. He started eating dinner at the long table again, something he hadn't done regularly since his wife passed. He'd nod at Ellie across the plates of beans and bread and stew, and when the men cleared out, she'd stay behind to help scrub the tin pans, their shoulders sometimes brushing, never lingering, but never pulling away. One night, as cicadas buzzed low and the fire crackled in the main house, Rhett pulled a small wooden box from a high shelf. Inside was a harmonica dulled by time, but still intact. He handed it to Ellie without a word. She looked at him confused. "Can you play?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not yet." He smiled, just a ghost of one, and nodded. "Then it's time you learn." It became a ritual, her sitting on the porch steps trying to coax notes from the old reed instrument in beside her with his arms folded, offering quiet guidance or just the comfort of presence. Sometimes he'd talk about cattle or fences or weather, but sometimes he spoke about his wife not in mourning, but in memory. And one evening, after a long silence, he said something that made Ellie go still. "I thought losing her meant losing the part of me that could love again. But lately, I'm not so sure." Ellie didn't answer. She didn't need to. She simply reached over and set the harmonica gently on his knee, then laid her hand over his. His fingers turned closing around hers, warm and sure. And in that moment, no one had to say a word about what was building between them. It wasn't a wildfire. It was a slow ember, tended carefully, protected from wind and doubt. It was the kind of love that grew not from spark, but from recognition of pain, of survival, of strength, of home. Painted Hollow had once been a place of order, routine, and grief. Now it was becoming something else entirely, not softer, but deeper, not safer, but truer. And at the center of it stood two people who had stopped running. By the time the leaves began to rustle gold in the late wind of October, Painted Hollow Ranch was no longer just a place marked by fences and cattle. It had become something else entirely, a kind of quiet testament to two people who had once been shadows, but chose instead to stand in the light. Rhett McCallan, once a man hollowed by grief and stitched together by routine, now walked the land with softer eyes, a quieter step, and a renewed sense of purpose. His world, once ruled by discipline and silence, had opened to something far more uncertain and far more alive. And at the center of that change was Ellie Harper, who no longer had to hide beneath another name, another voice, another shape. She worked the ranch openly now, not as a secret to be kept, but as a woman whose place had been hard-earned and deeply carved. The bunkhouse men, those who stayed, no longer saw her as a novelty or a threat, but as one of their own. Some still stumbled over her name, others still looked twice when she passed, but over time even those glances softened. She had outlasted their doubts. She had planted her roots, and though she carried the scars of the past in the way she sometimes flinched at sudden footsteps, or went quiet when thunder rolled in from the mesas, she no longer let fear dictate the terms of her life. Her days began with the sound of the coffee kettle whistling in the main house, and often ended with her seated on the porch steps beside Rhett, their hands brushing, but not always holding their words sparse, but meaningful. It wasn't a love story built on grand gestures. It was built on recognition. Two souls who knew what it meant to lose everything and still rise with the dawn. But their story was more than just healing and quiet comfort. It raised deeper, more enduring questions that hovered like dust in the still air. In a land governed more by instinct than law, what does it mean to choose honor when the world rewards brutality? What does it mean to defend truth when truth itself threatens your safety? And who gets to decide who you are, the world or you? For Ellie, reclaiming her name wasn't just about survival. It was about sovereignty. For Rhett, letting go of the rigid code that once ruled his life didn't mean abandoning justice, it meant evolving it. His greatest strength had once been his control, but now it was his capacity to see someone fully and still stay. The men on the ranch learned something too, though few would put it into words. They saw what it looked like when someone stood their ground, not with a shout, but with a steady voice and a loaded pistol. They witnessed what it meant for a woman to say no, and be believed, be defended, and be left standing. And that mattered. Out in Dust Haven, the whispers faded, replaced by newer, juicier gossip. The ranch's business kept steady. Fences got mended, calves were born, life moved on. But in quiet moments, when the wind carried the scent of rain and wild sage across the plains, anyone standing at the edge of Painted Hollow could feel it, the story that had taken root there. The one where a woman stopped running. The one where a man chose to stay. The one where silence became sanctuary, and sanctuary became home. And though their names might never appear in the dime novels, or the ballads sung in saloons, their story would linger in the soil, in the bones of the land, and in the way two people looked at each other across a worn porch as the sun dipped below the hills. In the West, some truths are written with bullets, others with love. And this truth was carved gently, unforgettably, into the red earth beneath their feet. If this story stirred something in you, a flicker of hope, a memory of strength, or a question left hanging in the dust, don't ride off just yet. Subscribe to Whispers of the West for more untold frontier tales of resilience, redemption, and quiet love that dares to endure. The West remembers, and so do we.